Shane Goldspink has spent 8 years at Coles as a health and safety advisor and has recently moved to TasPorts, but he'd like to share his perspective on the retail industry sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. So as Pam mentioned, I've recently left the retail industry. So, but I guess it hasn't been that long ago. And listening to some of the other people talking today and some of the issues that were put up on the slides earlier about some of the sort of the more common issues, I guess, that are still facing lots of industries. They're really the same in retail, and I'm really talking about manual handling, psychological hazards and injuries, and also falls, trips and slips. They really are presenting from my perspective and my experience in the grocery industry, the biggest challenges, I think. I guess when we think about retail and hearing about, again, some of the hazards that we've heard about recently, you could probably be forgiven for thinking that the retail industry is pretty low risk in terms of the activities it undertakes. But saying that, it does have quite a few challenges and certainly has a fairly big impact on quite a large number of people. Obviously, retail industry employs a lot of people, and most of us shop, so we're in amongst the business activity, particularly in grocery and supermarkets. So just from manual handling, I guess retail, in particular supermarkets, it's a really high volume type operation with low margins. So one of the biggest challenges is really moving stock from one area of the store to another. So we're really talking about stock coming from the receivables area in through the stock room, onto the shelves and through the registers. It's a really high, fast-paced environment, a really strong emphasis on productivity, trying to avoid as far as possible double handling, moving things around. Any time that happens, margins are obviously impacted. So it can be quite a fast-paced and physically demanding role. As well as that, it's obviously in the context of a fairly highly competitive market. Not so much in Tasmania, but nationally, there's a lot of ground being made up from other retailers. So the pressure on keeping the cost of doing business is fairly strong, and it is so. It is a little bit in Tasmania, but probably felt more in the other states, where the likes of the Aldis and the other supermarkets that are coming along to challenge the Woolies and the Coles. One of the other thing I was thinking about, and sort of a couple of stores sprung to mind in my experience at Coles, and you might shop at some of them, Sandy Bay, Wellington Street in Launceston, tiny little stores, and often, they were built decades ago, possibly with a certain expectation about how much stock, might be held. Now, particularly in Tasmania and certainly other areas across the country, that those stores have seen massive growth in terms of their sales volume. So they're actually holding a lot more stock than what they probably were originally designed for. So we're starting to see people having to work in smaller and restricted spaces, whether that be stock rooms or cool rooms. So they're performing these sort of fairly, intense manual tasks, often in not the most ideal conditions. So at its core, moving stock from one part of the store to the other is effectively process work. It's really highly repetitive and often involves prolonged manual handling. Obviously places a lot of risk in terms of musculoskeletal injury, and that is really probably the most common cause of injury certainly in the grocery sector and at Coles. So there've been lots of attempts to look at and modify the systems of work and to use different manual handling equipment to reduce the requirements on team members. But at this stage, it's still a manual task, and there's no automated processes in place, and people still need to lift and handle items repeatedly. And to put it into perspective, depending on the size of a store or the sales that they do, it could be anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 cartons of stock coming in each day, or most days of the week. This often comes in on pallets, and each of those items needs to be lifted multiple times to get it out onto the shelf. And when I say 2,000 or 3,000 cartons, that's in some cases just for one department, say the grocery department. Other departments will have their own, hundreds of cartons that they have to deal with as well. So that component of getting stock, out onto shelves is, as I said, highly intensive, and poses a fairly significant risk to our retail workers. Also, the registers, I'm not sure, but you may have had the pleasure of working on a register or checkout in your time. May or may not surprise you to know that in some cases register operators can scan up to several tonnes of stock over an 8-hour shift. Obviously some of the individual items, they don't need to be lifted, but we're talking about lots of small items repeatedly over long periods. So they're still handling thousands of items each shift and lifting hundreds of filled bags. And another point just to touch on is that we often think about the retail sector attracting the younger workforce, but I certainly in grocery, it really needs to face the challenge of an ageing workforce. There are people that have worked at Coles for a really long time, and I guess irrespective of age, some of the physical capabilities of the workforce don't always match the demands of the job, whether that be working in stock rooms or up on the register. So just touching on some psychological hazards, I guess I've outlined really some of the challenges that can impact the physical well-being of workers. I think the fast-paced, time-restricted environment that they often work in obviously has some impacts on the psychological health and well-being of people in the retail sector. Often workers will feel both direct or indirect pressure to do their job well in a fairly modest amount of time, and that time seems to be sort of less and less rather than getting more and more. So the feeling that there's not enough time to get things done, and often in the context of processes falling down or things not going to plan, just adds that extra level of pressure. The job still needs to get done, so it certainly leaves people feeling quite stressed and anxious at times. So and I guess the other component that retail does face that I think can potentially impact on psychological health and well-being of workers is that they're also dealing with customers, and I'm sure everyone here is a model customer when they go into a supermarket, but not everyone is, and sometimes the interactions between customers themselves can be quite challenging. Customer behaviour can range from sort of mild annoyance to the fact that their favourite brand of peas is not on sale anymore. But sometimes it can be quite unpleasant, and people can actually get quite verbally or physically aggressive. Often the physical aggression comes from some of the workers trying to intervene when they see what they suspect as being people stealing or shoplifting. So certainly at Coles there were fairly clear expectations about what people should do in the event that they saw, suspected shoplifting. But I think in many cases, some of the workers sort of saw it as their duty or even moral obligation to step in and intervene, and unfortunately put themselves at significant risk. And it, certainly had some quite a few cases where people have been quite badly physically assaulted by people who have been not even necessarily directly accused of shoplifting. Last thing I'll touch on was the slips and trips and falls, and I guess from that perspective, probably the largest the cohort of people within the retail sector that is impacted by that is the customer. Obviously team contractors and visitors are also impacted, but basically product that finds its way on the floor, and in particular fresh produce poses a significant risk from a slips and trips and falls perspective, and quite nasty injuries can arise from that. So I think one of the challenges, certainly from my experience working at Coles, that sort of presented itself was how does the business kind of balance out the shopping experience, having nice, shiny, clean floors with the good look, the touch and feel of the produce that's available, with kind of balancing that with making sure that, if something were to find itself on the floor, how do we stop it getting on the floor in the first place? And if it does find its way on the floor, how do we prevent that from causing an injury? So I think that adds another complexity in terms of the challenges for the retail industry. So I really just focused on the challenges and the issues that I think identified. I don't have a lot of answers, and I think those challenges have been in the retail industry for quite some time, certainly in grocery, and unfortunately I think there's a chance that they'll still be there in a little while unless someone's got some great ideas about how to solve them. So I'm sure people within the supermarket industry would be happy to hear from you. Thanks very much.